We're going to be considering some deep existential questions, questions that have driven scientists to great lengths to study and ask the questions such as, what is the universe? And how is the universe? So we can get closer to answering the question, why is the universe? And why are we? And with that, we'll start with our opening question. We'll be asking both of our speakers to answer the question, how do you integrate the whole of scientific knowledge into your worldview? Do you see the whole of scientific knowledge as consistent with your beliefs? And we would appreciate if you would tell us how you arrived at your worldview and what personal factors influenced you. And with that, we'd like to begin with Sean. Oh, and we'll be referring to each other by our less grand names.
Yes, I do consider scientific knowledge to be consistent with my worldview. First, I'd just like to thank the Veritas Forum for organizing the event. This is a great thing to have happen, and for everyone here thank everyone here for coming to the event, with the single exception of my graduate students who I see in the audience who should be back in the office working. But the rest of you, it's good that you're here, and we will have a respectful discussion, I believe. For those of you who don't know, I'm on the naturalist side of things, and Hans is on the theistic side of things. That's fair categorization. So it's no difficulty for me to say that, yes, the scientific view of the world integrates quite nicely with my entire view of the world. There are bigger questions, though. I think that as a naturalist, I prefer the term naturalist to atheist. Atheist is fine. I don't disown the term. I don't believe in God. I think that God is not a useful way to think about the world, so I'm an atheist, not even an agnostic. But naturalist is more of a positive way of characterizing my view of the world. I think there is a single reality, the natural world. It obeys rules, and we can find some of those rules. We can get closer and closer to understanding them well through empirical observation and the scientific method. I think that's what we do, and so there's no problem fitting that into, in my view, a consistent worldview. But I do respect the fact that, as a naturalist, there's plenty of questions to which we don't know the answers yet. We have some answers figured out in naturalism, but there's the hard questions of value and meaning and purpose, I think, have answers in a naturalistic framework, but we don't know what the right answers are, or even if there are such things as the right answers. That's a dialogue that we need to be having and taking seriously. So even though I'm a committed naturalist, I'm very far from believing that we're finished in constructing what that worldview really means.
We're at Caltech, right? So we know that integration problems are difficult, right? And I have a constraint on my integration problem. So first of all, I'll say that scientific knowledge I try to take with utter seriousness. I try to take what experts in fields other than my own say about scientific facts very seriously, and I take my own study of scientific facts very seriously. And yet, very deeply entrenched in the center of my worldview are some beliefs that are religious, theistic beliefs, beliefs like God exists, God created the universe, God even sent his son to die for us. So I've got to see how these two sorts of things hang together. That's my integration problem, my integration issue. Now, I'll be honest also and say I'm not sure what integration is supposed to mean exactly besides being consistent. Now, of course, we all think we should be consistent. You can't believe true things if you believe in consistent things. So, let me first of all say, though, that I don't believe in certain extreme cases of what you might consider integration. I think these are ideals that won't work, can't possibly work. One ideal is the idea that your religious beliefs, in particular things you derive from a holy scripture or things you derive from church authority, will tell you how the world works in exquisite detail. My reasons for thinking that won't happen are actually largely theological in nature. I don't think that's what I don't think God communicated to us facts about the details of nature through scriptures. On the opposite extreme, though, I don't think that you're going to arrive at a worldview reliably by sitting back, opening your eyes, and letting nature bathe over you and tell you, here's what you ought to believe. I don't think I would reliably arrive at any worldview if I just sat here passively. So I think that the question of integration isn't going to go in either extreme direction. That is, you're not going to derive your science from your faith, from your religious commitment, and you're not going to derive your fundamental metaphysical worldviews from your scientific research. Now, let me just point out that, first of all, I think let's be honest. This is true to the scientific data. Let's talk about the details of science. So when you read a science textbook, say, take a textbook from quantum field theory, are the statements in that textbook the sorts of things that could replace religious belief or even conflict with religious belief? Not usually. So the kind of statements I read in a textbook of fundamental physics are things like the fundamental particles are classified by irreducible representations of the gauge group. Now, that's not going to contradict my religious beliefs, for one, because it doesn't even use the same words as my religious beliefs. There can't be a contradiction there. Of course, also, I'm not going to derive that claim from my religious beliefs. That's a ridiculous idea that somehow you're going to open the Bible and arrive at that belief. So, in my view, there is some independence between the two sides. Okay. That said, now let's not also deny that there are cases where these two, so I'm not going to take the Stephen Jay Gould line and say these two will never conflict, so let's just go home. I've got my separate religious world that has nothing to do with my view of the world of facts. So there are cases where they start to come together. What do I do in those sorts of cases? So, and the answer here also is not simple. Sometimes you do one thing, sometimes you do another thing. It all depends on the situation. It depends what, on balance, you think the rational thing is to do. So one example where I might have thought that religion was telling me something, and then I said, once I know the scientific facts, I think I was wrong, is the age of the universe. I think that if you thought religion was teaching you the age of the universe is 6,000 years or something, that's a belief you should give up. That's one case. But I'm not saying that every time I encounter something that looks like science is speaking, I retreat and say my religion must have been wrong. Because I think there are lots of cases where scientists say things that actually don't really follow from the science they're examining. So take an example where I'm not an expert, but here's where I take a stand, is somebody says, if you take evolutionary biology seriously, which I do, then you can't believe that the universe was designed. You can't believe that the universe has a designer. That's where I stop and I say, I don't buy it. I don't see the argument. It doesn't look like rigorous science to me. So I think that's an interpretive gloss on the science. So that's a case where I let my religion kick back and say, I think there's a difference between scientific fact and metaphysical gloss on scientific fact.
Excellent. And sort of leading into that and how we allow for, how would your religious, or I guess your worldview, map into this question? In their book, The Grand Design, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow write, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. He writes, spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to touch the light, to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. So Hans, do you agree with this?
I wouldn't say these statements are false as much as misleading. So I think these sentences carry a connotation that I think could lead you astray. So let me start with the last thing, this claim that, so actually let me make a qualification first, okay? And then we'll set the qualification aside. The qualification is, should we believe a metaphysical picture that's based on science that hasn't been well established? And let's be honest, the cosmological models that Hawking and Mlodinow are arguing from are not well-established cosmological models. So even if I thought they could make a good argument based on that cosmology for the sort of worldview picture they're giving, well, that cosmology is not something I'm necessarily going to commit myself to yet. So that's the qualification. But now let me suspend that qualification and say, look, let's suppose that there were some cosmological model, as Hawking and Mlodinow are describing, where, for example, there was some sort of quantum mechanical process. I think this is the general idea they have in mind. A quantum mechanical process that explains the existence of space-time and matter. Okay, so the idea is you have some sort of quantum wave function, there's a probability for nothing existing, and there's a probability for something existing. Now notice, of course, the word nothing here, we have to be careful because even if nothing in terms of space-time and matter existed, there was still the wave function that determined the probability. So, okay, still, let's set this aside. Let's just think about the statements they make. Okay, so the statement, it's not necessary for God to get the thing started. Now, I have a couple reactions to this. The first reaction is, so? There are similar examples. So take the theory of inertia, where we say that something, or the idea of inertia, which of course is much modified in contemporary physics, but this traditional modern physical idea, that an object will it'll continue in rectilinear motion unless affected by a force. So you might think, aha, we thought God was necessary to sustain things in motion, but now we have this physical explanation, inertia, so therefore we don't need God anymore. God drops out of the picture. And I just think, if you thought you needed God to get a good explanation of physical facts, then you weren't doing science in the right way. Because you can have a perfectly reasonable scientific description of a phenomenon, I think, that lives up to good scientific standards and still believe that God is incredibly active in the process. Just say, I don't have scientific control over the way God was interacting with this process. That's not something that I can build a good scientific theory about. So when they say, if we had a theory that gave an intricate physical mechanism to bring the universe into existence, then you have a reason not to believe in God. I think this is highly misleading. And actually, I think it portrays, I think they're arguing against, this is not their fault that they have to argue against people who have had bad ideas, arguing against this idea that the only place for God is perhaps at the beginning of the universe, a sort of deistic idea that God is there to get it started and then God sits back and watches the universe go. But I think a lot of theists, especially theists in the tradition that I come from, they were never tempted to think about God that way in the first place. I think they think God is active all the time and everywhere, and so you shouldn't wait for science to have a gap and then seize upon that gap and say, there's God. Because no, he's also there in the natural mechanisms that we use science to describe.
Now, Sean, I think that you could offer a different perspective.
Yeah. So I knew this was going to happen. There's 3 things I want to say, and each of them I need about half an hour to say. Is that okay? Do we have time? I'll try to be very brief. So the first one is, I think I agree with Hans, actually, that at the very least, the phraseology being used is sloppy, that Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow used. I wouldn't have put it that way. I think that the point they're getting at is that modern cosmology has reached a point where there exist plausible cosmological models that are completely self-contained. In fact, there exist both eternal models that go from time equals infinity to minus infinity to plus infinity. There exist finite models where the universe had an earliest moment of time that is more like the closed surface of a sphere or something like that. And so there's no need, is the point they're making, to invoke anything outside the natural world to account for the existence of the natural world. You can find a self-contained model. And I completely agree that the actual models we're talking about are very, very speculative. They're not established. But the fact that they exist means that if, as some people do, you are relying on the need to have something outside the universe explain the existence of the universe, then that need has gone away, plausibly. And so that's not a knockdown, drag-out argument against the existence of God, but there was one argument you could have given for the existence of God that is no longer necessarily there. The second point is, so you might nevertheless want to ask questions about why there is a universe at all, even if you have a theory where the universe either exists forever or is self-contained and came into existence at some moment. You could still ask why. Why is there a universe at all? And I think that the correct, hardcore response from the naturalist is, why not? The questions that we ask about why is this true rather than some other thing, the mom comes home, why aren't the dishes done? That's a question that has an answer because it's within a context of a set of expectations. Mom had an expectation that someone was going to do those dishes, and that expectation was not met. If you want to ask, as a serious philosophical or scientific question, why does the universe exist? I claim that is a question that only makes sense if you have some pre-existing set of expectations for whether or not the universe was likely to exist. We have no such set of pre-existing expectations. There's no framework. There's no set of universes out of which we have chosen one. There's no, logical reason to say, well, it was more likely to have no universe at all. As a naturalist, I believe there are some nomological facts. There are some things that are simply true about the world. There's no absolute necessity to anything true about the physical world. And so the universe exists, thank goodness, but it's not something that I necessarily have to explain by some extra mechanism. And the third point, which I think I could tie into this question, but it actually was inspired by Hans's first answer to the first question, He said, with a certain facetious air, you wouldn't expect to open up the Bible and see it tell you that elementary particles are representations of the gauge symmetry groups. And I would like to know, why shouldn't I expect that? In a more general feature, if I do believe that the Bible or some other sacred religious text is telling me anything true and non-trivial about the world, something that we have gotten from religious experience or revelation or direct contact with the deity or whatever it is, if there's something that we get that we could not have gotten by ordinary scientific explanation, why in the world didn't God tell us some useful scientific facts? I would claim that the only reason we don't expect to find useful scientific facts in religious texts is because we don't find useful scientific facts in religious texts. You might say, well, we didn't have the vocabulary 2,000 years ago to be told that elementary particles were in representations of the gauge groups. I would claim that God could have done it. He's God. God could write the world's most awesome textbook. He could have explained these things even a long time ago. And even if he chose not to, he could have said, you know what? The universe is billions of years old. He could have said, we're made of atoms. He could have said many, many true but non-trivial things at the time, and he never did. There's no religious tradition that really comes out and says remarkably true, interesting, non-trivial scientific facts long before science found them. And I think that if we're judging the two models, the two ontologies of theism versus naturalism, and saying what would we expect to be true under these two views of the world, if we didn't know the actual history of religious texts, I would have guessed that they would have told us something interesting and non-trivial about the natural world. Therefore, the fact that they don't, I count as evidence against that point of view.
Yeah, so no, actually, I think Sean raises a really vexing problem. And I think, here's my own take on this, because it's a problem actually that I was very troubled by as a younger person, and occasionally still gives me trouble, but I'm gradually working out a view here. Okay, so there's several things to say, some less serious, some more serious. So less serious things, so look, of course, I don't think any serious theist thinks they know why God did things the way he did. I think the theists sit back and go, this is pretty weird, the universe we live in. It's pretty weird how things have happened. And I think if you don't bring too many expectations to the table, which I think scientists and theists alike have learned not to do, then it doesn't bother you as much. But so one thing to say with slightly less seriousness is if God had told us in the Bible about the fundamental particles, for example, we wouldn't have had jobs now. And so, you know, I actually think that, I think in a way this is very...
Thanks, God.
So,
my graduate students, thank you. My
yes.
postdocs, thank you.
So
yes.
Slightly less facetiously, I think that there's a common theme among theists to think that God giving us free will, which is a very mysterious thing, how an omnipotent creator could create creatures with freedom, and I don't have the key to unlock that mystery. But if I take that mystery on board, then the mystery of needing to make further scientific discoveries, I think, is just a blip past that first mystery, because why would God leave it to us to go out and make discoveries, to be, as you might say, co-creators, right? To go out and build models. Now, my experience, the little bit I've done of that kind of thing, what scientists do, it's an extremely satisfying thing where you take control of reality in the sense of you build a perspective that makes it intelligible. And it's consonant with my view of theism that God would hand that over to us instead of just sitting and feeding into our brains facts about the universe. That's one thing. So now on a much more serious note, because again, if the Bible is the authoritative revelation, let me make this a bit more personal. I actually remember in college thinking, why would I ever study science when I have a Bible? Because the important truths are in the Bible. Why would I go waste time, you know, in a laboratory? This is a real practical problem, I think, for a theist. Now, many years since, how did I end up not doing that? Well, it's a longer story, but how do I retrospectively now think this was the right thing for me to do, to not just sit there reading a Bible and never to look at the natural world? Is I think, again, I don't know why exactly God didn't reveal all these things to us, But I think the theme of God's omnipotence is so important. God could create whatever universe he wanted to. God could create whatever laws of the universe he wanted to. And I think that's an incredibly powerful motivator towards empiricism, towards the view that the way to know about reality is to just go look. Because you're not going to arrive at understanding reality just by meditating on the nature of God, because God has freedom. God isn't constrained by some higher than God laws of what would be a good universe. No, God just chooses the universe he wills to exist. How can we know which one that is? Open our eyes.
And that gets us to a question about why this universe and why a fine-tuned universe. In his book, Just Six Numbers, The Deep Forces That Shape the Universe, the leading astrophysicist, Martin Rees, argues that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned for life, and that we have three options when we think about this. The first is pure chance, which he finds extremely hard to believe. The second, it was planned that way by a creator, God, which he says many of his callings believe, but he does not. And third, there are infinite number of universes, and we happen to live in the one that actually sustains life. Sean, could you tell us, what do you think about this multiverse theory, and what does a fine-tuned universe really mean for us philosophically?
Yeah, I think two major things here. One is that I think that the confidence that we have in the statement that the universe in which we actually live really is finely tuned is very, very exaggerated in the popular imagination, and even among scientists. There's very little what I would call serious work done trying to quantify this. If you were really serious about the statement that the universe in which we live is finely tuned, especially for the existence of intelligent life, what does that mean? That means you would write down the space of all possible ways the universe could be. And then you would write down the space of all possible ways the universe could be in which there could be life. And then you would have some measure on both of those spaces, and you would do an integral of one and an integral of the other, and you would divide and get a fraction, and you would say it's a small number. Nobody does anything like that. What does it mean to have a universe that allows for the existence of life? It might mean that the universe has the computational capacity to be a Turing machine, that the universe can do any kind of calculation that you might want to conceivably do. And therefore, there can be parts of the universe that have intelligent information processing systems. If that's your definition, it's easy to get a universe that has the ability to contain intelligent life. Whereas in the actual discussions about fine-tuning, people are incredibly parochial and anthropocentric. They make statements like, well, you know, if we didn't have exactly the plate tectonics that we had on Earth 2 billion years ago, then life never would have made it past a certain stage. And that's an incredibly narrow view, that if life were any different than exactly the history that we actually had, it wouldn't have existed. The real way that we go from the fundamental laws of physics in our world to you and me and other intelligent beings is not something that we understand even in the actual world. If you change the world to something else, to have the chutzpah to say, then life could not possibly exist, I find difficult to support. So I'm not sure that there is that much fine-tuning, to be honest. But maybe there is. I would consider it an open problem. To me, it's exactly analogous to a little over 100 years ago, we had Lord Kelvin worried about Darwinian evolution, because he was an expert in thermodynamics, and he calculated the lifetime of the sun, because the sun was burning coal or something like that, and there's not that many years the sun could have gone on burning. So there was a problem. The sun couldn't last long enough to actually support the entire necessary history of life to explain the evolution that we thought existed. And this was a big problem, but in retrospect, it was obvious we didn't understand the physics that well. To me, the fine-tuning problem is just like that. We don't understand the relevant physics that well. But of course, as you allude to, we also have a perfectly good naturalistic explanation, which can go under the innocent-sounding name of environmental selection. So no one is surprised that life arose on the surface of the Earth rather than on the surface of the sun, even though the surface of the sun is much bigger. Or the volume of interstellar space where there's nothing there at all, much, much bigger than the volume of atmosphere here on Earth. And yet we don't have this fine-tuning problem. How unlikely was it that we arose here on Earth? Why? Because the conditions here on Earth are obviously much different than on the sun or in interstellar space, and much more hospitable to the existence of life. So the multiverse idea simply says that the little tiny bit of universe that we can observe a few tens of billion light years across is not necessarily the whole universe. Maybe conditions are wildly different in other places in the universe. Just like Giordano Bruno made a big step hundreds of years ago when he said maybe our planet, maybe our star is not the only one. Maybe there's billions of them. Well, maybe there are millions or more different universes. And many of them might not allow for the existence of life if it's true that life needs this kind of fine-tuning. Many people find this to be a little bit extravagant. You're just trying to explain the existence of life here in our universe, and you're postulating billions and billions and billions of other universes. But that attitude is completely misguided. Whether or not the multiverse is real, I have days in which I think it's likely and days in which I think it's don't. It's not extravagant, because the multiverse is not a theory. It's not, there's this image that some physicists got tired of doing integrals and real work one day and collecting data, and they were sitting around with some beers and said, dude, what if there were like 1 million universes? That would be awesome. That is not how it happened. What happens is you have theories like string theory to help explain quantum gravity and inflationary cosmology to explain the isotropy and homogeneity of the universe, theories that were invented for entirely different reasons, theories which are in themselves quite simple in their fundamental formulations, and these theories predict the existence of a multiverse. It's not like you separately postulate universe after universe, it's like the integers. There's an infinite number of integers, but no one thinks that's extravagant because there's a simple rule given one integer for making the next one. Likewise, with the multiverse, there's a simple set of rules that give you many, many, many universes. We don't know if those rules are true. It's very speculative physics, but it's not hard to get it or to imagine it. So if it turns out to be true, that you really need to finely tune the environmental conditions of the universe in order to get life, then we have a very easy way of doing that. It's not at all some knockdown, drag-out argument against naturalism.
To be fair, the rules that you're talking about are talking about some number of multiverses, but not infinite necessarily.
It doesn't really matter. Once you get more than one universe, getting the third and the fourth and the 10 to the 1,000th is no problem.
Very well. And Hans, do you think that this universe is fine-tuned? And how do you feel about the implications for a multiverse, whether it exists, or whether there are many or many, many, many?
Okay, so I do believe this universe is fine-tuned, but I found that, so I sometimes teach, to earn a living, I teach introductory logic, and I've learned some interesting facts about human psychology doing this. One of those facts is humans have the hardest time detecting invalidity in arguments when they agree with the conclusion of the argument. Okay, so if you give a student an argument, a simple argument that is obviously invalid, but they're firmly committed to the conclusion, they may very well say it's valid. Okay, that's how I feel about the fine-tuning arguments, is I agree with the conclusion. I think God willed for there to be human beings that could enter into a relationship with him, all the traditional things from a Christian worldview. But when I look at the arguments that people give for that, I go, no, I can't put my name behind that, because first of all, they have what look to me as false premises. As Sean mentioned, I agree completely with what Sean said. In fact, I'm very glad he said what he said, because I was a little bit nervous that I was being too skeptical in my thoughts about this as sort of more of a student of the physics rather than someone who's doing cutting edge work here. And I just thought, I know general relativity, I passed the exam. They never taught us how to compute the probability that the cosmological constant would lie in a certain range. That just wasn't part of the theory. And then when you get to the really hard parts, like, well, put it into the Hamiltonian formulation and then take the Liouville measure on the space of universes, and you go, well, how do I calculate the size of the hospitable universes? It's a very hard problem. Thankfully, Sean and one of his graduate students did some of the calculations, and surprise, the life-friendly universes are actually pretty likely. So there's a lot of hard work to be done here that I'm afraid some of the advocates for fine-tuning arguments haven't done the work, and that's an embarrassment. So I think that should be stopped. I think people should work harder to understand the arguments they're making. But now, anytime you say an argument is not good, even if you agree with the conclusion, a lot of people also think that is a reason to sort of check off one of the reasons for believing in the conclusion, right? You go, aha, that argument didn't work, so therefore my credence in the conclusion goes down. I say that is okay reasoning, except if you already had a reason to be suspicious of those types of arguments. And I, pre-physics, already am worried about fine-tuning types of argument. So let me just mention one reason why I think if you just start thinking in terms of theological concepts, you'll think something really fishy is going on here. So let's think of the sort of picture that I'm sure it's been published elsewhere, but I saw Roger Penrose give a talk with this picture. And the picture was of this dartboard, this huge dartboard, and there's God sitting back there with the dart, and there's the bullseye. It's so small. And Penrose loves, to write this huge number, right, of the possibilities. And God, we need God to hit the bullseye, because look, if you had a random mindless process, throw a dart at this target, it wouldn't go in the bullseye. And so then you think, aha, what do we need? We need God to put it there. Now here's where, if you're actually just thinking theologically, you go, no, God builds the target, right? God makes the laws of physics if God exists, if God's the creator. And so you don't need God. God doesn't need to pick out the right universe among all the ones he's constrained, all these possibilities he has no control over. If he makes the laws, he decides which universes are possible. He decides how likely it is to have one of the two. So in other words, to put it in techie physics terms, God picks the measure on the space of possibilities. So would a theist want to say you need God to steer the universe out of its most likely outcome, namely lifeless? It doesn't sound theologically very sound to me.
All right. Going towards the implications of quantum mechanics on logic and materialism. In popular culture, quantum mechanics is often employed to prop up logically inconsistent ideas to much comic effect. Schrodinger's cat is dead, Schrodinger's cat is alive. Additionally, some physicists and philosophers have claimed that quantum mechanics undermines materialism. In fact, just last year, the physicist Stephen Barr argued that quantum mechanics makes it easier to believe in God. In light of these examples, what bearing does quantum mechanics have on the reliability of logic? In other words, can we trust it? And on materialism? Hans, could you?
Yes, so let me actually, if I could, set aside part of that question, just sort of take part of that question and say, I don't see any argument that's going to be made in this direction. It's saying quantum mechanics doesn't somehow makes us question the rules of logic. My experience learning quantum mechanics means you exercise logic to your utmost, right? You think really hard about what follows from what. And yes, it defies common sense, and that's because common sense isn't very logical. Okay, so let me set aside the question of whether quantum mechanics is logical, just to say it's very mathematical. That makes it hard for people. But what about the question of materialism? Now, so the story essentially is, early 20th century, we discover this new theory. We have problems with classical physics, and it makes predictions that just aren't right, so you come up with a new theory. And the new theory is very ill understood at first, of course. And you have this amazing, this sudden jump to pretty wild speculation about what's going on, because it doesn't fit with the traditional view. And many people in the early developers of quantum mechanics said, so you've got some immaterialism, materialism is falsified. For example, one of the main claims was you need a conscious observer to come in, so you have this quantum wave function, it's in a superposition of two possibilities. You have to have a conscious observer come in and select one of those two. And so, look, materialism has been shown false, is what they claimed. Now, this is, I claim, an abuse of science insofar as you say the science is telling us that. That's what science is telling us. Now, I think it's, in a sense, excusable because these physicists, early 20th century physicists, were reacting to the same abuse from the opposite side that was practiced in the 19th century. The abuse of people saying, look, if you believe physics, if you believe this theory, the description of the universe given by physics, you cannot believe in anything but material particles moving through space. I think it's also an abuse of physics, that physics doesn't entail that. Okay, so I think both abuses have occurred. Now let me just speak to the second one, the quantum mechanics and immaterialism, and say, look, it's just flatly, essentially mathematically provable that you don't have to believe in any non-physical thing to believe the predictions of quantum mechanics, because there are models of quantum mechanics, as Sean described cosmology earlier, self-contained models of quantum mechanics that make no mention of minds, souls, spirits, angels. So therefore, you can be a content materialist with quantum mechanics. I believe that. That said, I think quantum mechanics it gives us a sort of philosophical point, a sort of surprise that some of us already knew and others of us need to be reminded of, and that is materialism is a research project. It's a worldview. It is not an empirical claim that is tested in the laboratory. Or if it is tested in the laboratory, it was falsified by quantum mechanics. But a good materialist doesn't go, oh, I was wrong about materialism. A good materialist says, okay, so what I thought material was, that wasn't quite right. Material must be different than I thought it was. So it's a retrenchment. It's exactly, to my mind, the sort of retrenchment that religious people engage in. When they find a tentative conflict with scientific data and their religious beliefs, what do? Do they immediately abandon their religious beliefs, their overall life research program? No, they go, well, I must have been a little bit wrong about the religious beliefs and what they entail about the world, so I better reconfigure things a little bit.
Yeah, sadly, we are in almost complete agreement on this one. I mean, obviously, quantum mechanics does not call in any way into question the rules of logic. Logic is quite important in doing quantum mechanics correctly. Whether it calls into question materialism is, to me, one of those uninteresting questions that just depends on exactly what you mean by materialism, which I think is, what I'm trying to say is probably quite consistent with what Hans was just saying. You know, if your idea of what materialism was is really committed to some pre-quantum mechanics idea of what constitutes material, then quantum mechanics has changed all that. But the underlying sort of spiritual meaning of materialism hasn't changed. Quantum mechanics is a formal sort of model that attempts to explain our world of experience through a set of connections between what the formal model is saying and what you're counting as the data you're observing and so forth, just like Newtonian mechanics was. I mean, no one ever opened their eyes and saw a momentum vector or anything like that, but once Hamilton and Lagrange had come along and explained to us how to use these things, we could treat those as part of our theories and they didn't seem that strange. Nowadays, we have Hilbert space and wave functions, and we can't visualize them or see them, but they're part of our best description of the material world. We know how to match them onto the observations we make. It doesn't seem like a big deal to me. It doesn't seem like a major change. There are definitely major changes in how we view the world, from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. And the major one is when we observe things, we don't sort of observe them in their pristine form. The things that you can possibly see when you look at something in quantum mechanics are different than what there really is when you're not looking at that. And that's because you are a quantum mechanical system as well as what you're looking at, and there's a long set of explanations that will depend on your favorite version of quantum mechanics. And this is all absolutely crucial, important stuff for scientists and philosophers to work out, with essentially no really foundational implications for whether or not materialism is true in any relevant sense, I would say.
All right, you've all been too much agreeable. We're going somewhere where you're not going to agree. We're going there. Okay, so this is a question for reflection. What do you see as the biggest weakness of your worldview in terms of logical coherence? And also, what is the most difficult aspect for you to live out your worldview in real life? And I will ask the other person to comment.
I think the biggest problems for me in coherence are the things I believe that contradict each other. No, of course I don't
Agreed.
do that. No, okay, look, there is a problem, not only I think intrinsically, but a problem's not the right word, a challenge that's intrinsic to a religion based on some sort of revelation like Christianity. So it's a challenge in general, but also it's a challenge that drives me crazy. And I wish the world would just be much more simple. So the challenge is that revealed religions where you had a revelation that occurs historically and that's not ongoing. Now, I mean, of course, some people have different beliefs. I don't believe God speaks to me in a clear voice directly, but I do believe that there have been special events of revelation. I do believe that, as Christians do, that Christ was the core revelation of God's plan for humanity and redemption and so on. But so revelations are made at a specific time. That means to specific people in specific cultures who have their own specific worldviews, and a lot of those parts of their worldviews that we disagree with. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is, though, if you take the religion seriously, that means you have to come to the data that they've passed down to you with a innocent until proven guilty attitude. That's what it means to believe there's a revelation in there, packaged in there. And so, first of all, it's a challenge, because what are the rules for determining the difference between revealed truth and incidental gloss on that truth that was given by a particular person in a particular cultural setting? So, of course, this is similar to the problem I mentioned before about scientists who have some pretty hard scientific data, on the one hand, that we want to believe, versus their metaphysical gloss on that data, which is sort of more optional to believe. If you're an empiricist, if you believe in taking empirical reality as a guide towards true belief. So that's, first of all, a challenge, I think, for any theist, for anyone who believes in a revealed religion. And it's a challenge to me. I am actually, would kind of prefer someone to just, I'd like to have a big cosmic mommy who would just tell me what's true and what's false, so I wouldn't have to worry and say I'm probably going to get it wrong in some cases. So that's something that actually I don't love about messy parts of a system of beliefs.
And Sean, do you think that that is the weakest part of a Christian or theistic worldview, or do you think that there's something else that's actually more troublesome?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say.
What disturbs you the most?
Yeah, I think that the most troublesome part of the Christian worldview is I don't think it's true. I think that's the worst part.
What is the hardest thing to believe, or what do you think is the most logically inconsistent then, besides it not being true?
You know, I don't necessarily, I'm not trying to weasel out, I don't necessarily think that it is logically inconsistent. I can certainly imagine a world in which God existed and cared about us human beings and judged us and rewarded us, and there was an afterlife, and whatever version of the religious goodie bag you want to keep. Or not. I can imagine a sort of deistic universe in which God makes the universe and then goes away. I think that all these are plausible.
Are you saying that that could be this universe, but you don't tend toward that?
Not. I'm saying that those could be universes. So I think that, you know, where the trouble comes in is if I think that, to me, it really is an empirical question, not a logical question. I think that if I try to be honest and I try to forget about what the universe is actually like, what I know to be true in the universe, and if I try to ask myself, what would I expect the universe to be like under theism and under naturalism, there's such an enormously large disconnect between what I would expect the universe to be like under theism and what the universe is actually like, that I don't think that's a bridgeable gap. I think the universe is big and we are small. I think that there's all sorts of random suffering in the universe. I think that there are completely different religions that people grow up in depending on where they were born and what year they were born in. I think that there's, you know, no good evidence for violations of the laws of physics that we would qualify as miracles and so forth. And I think that if theism were true, these would be way different, not like a little bit different. I think it'd be perfectly obvious. How in the world can God exist and care about us and leave us any room for doubt? That just boggles my mind.
Get to that.
It seems mean.
And to follow up, what is the most difficult thing about adopting an atheist or naturalistic worldview? What is the most thing logically that you struggle with? And also then personally in living it out?
Yeah, again, I don't think, I'm just not finding the logical inconsistencies here in either point of view. I think that logically, naturalism holds together very, very well. But there are living your life questions that I think are absolutely crucial. So the way that I would put it is that 500 years ago, there was a sense in which our worldview was vertically integrated, right? We had some fundamental ontology that God existed and created the universe and cares about us. And it went all the way up to living your everyday life because God played a role in your everyday life and the church and the community played a valuable role. And what naturalism has done is undermined the bottom level of that skyscraper, but has not replaced the upper levels. I think that empirically, naturalists don't have anything like a replacement for the sense of community and charity and caring that religions have prided themselves on throughout history. There's obviously bad things that religions have done also, but there are also good things. I'm happy to admit there are good things. And it's a legitimate worry that we might not have any obvious replacement for them. And it's an even bigger worry that we don't have clear-cut answers to some of the questions about meaning, purpose, morality, all the judgment questions. Naturalism is very good at explaining what the world is and what happens. It's not very good at explaining what should happen, what we should think about the world. I firmly believe that there are plausible answers to questions of value and meaning and purpose, and they rely on the fact that we create value and meaning and purpose, that I am a human being and I have values and I have purposes, and I am part of the natural world, so it's completely consistent. But we naturalists don't agree. We don't even agree on the way to talk about these things. There's many, many people who are committed atheists who are absolutely beholden to the idea that there are objective moral values out there in the world. Probably most atheists think that. And I don't think that, and I think they're all wrong. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I just haven't figured it out yet, but at any rate, there are no sort of consensus points of view that I think we could rely on. And I don't think that's something to be ashamed of. I think that, naturalism is something that is still in its baby steps. It's a few hundred years old, and the universe is 14 billion years old. We have a long way to go, and these are the much harder problems. Figuring out the mass of the electron is enormously easy compared to figuring out what's a good person and what's a bad person.
And Hans, could you comment?
Yeah, actually, so what Sean has said here, I'm actually very inspired by the way he's so humble about not knowing how everything is supposed to work out. And actually so my critique of naturalism as an overall worldview package applies less here in this case to Sean, is what I'm bothered by mostly in sort of blunt, overt naturalists is the amount of certainty they seem to display. It's just obvious that they're right. Because
I'm right.
but you just don't know it, so.
Things I don't know, but the things I know, I'm right about, yeah.
We wouldn't have them here if they were uncertain.
But so I just think that on either side of worldview divides about these fundamental questions, I just don't get people who think questions here have obvious answers, and that if you just become a really good logician, you'll know what the right thing to believe is here. Because look, like I said before, I would love it if it was that easy, because I would love to take the responsibility off my own shoulders for deciding how to live. I would love it if someone would just say, look, here's how you should live, just do it. Instead, I have to take a risk and say, look, there's some balance of, some evidence that looks like that, some evidence that looks like that. Now, choose a life. And so naturalists who say, look, okay, obviously, if you're going to be scientifically minded, that's the life you choose, that strikes me as actually just irrational. Whereas beyond that, look, I'm not going to say, again, I don't think naturalism is inconsistent. I think it has I think Sean points exactly at some of what you might say, weak points, the harder points, but it's part of for naturalists, the ongoing research program, namely questions of value, where do values come from, and questions of integration, because of course it is true that there have been times in history, like, for a brief time in the 13th century or whatever, where the Christian worldview crystallized and they thought they had it all figured out. And now, the whole world, we're all in this big state of flux, right? We don't have a unified picture that demands consensus in our society. So I think it's an ongoing project for all of us to try to reach a better consensus.
And in light of sort of thoughts on the shoulds in the world and morality, could you talk a little bit about what are the implications, if any, does quantum field theory have on determinism and free will, which are necessary for exercising those shoulds?
I think there's some interesting questions here. Quantum field theory is the specific version of quantum mechanics that seems to apply to our everyday world, but it's really just quantum mechanics. There's no special implications of field theory over and above regular quantum mechanics for questions of determinism or free will or anything like that. According to quantum mechanics, there are some predictions for observational outcomes that are irreducibly probabilistic. I'm a believer in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which says that the evolution of the universe itself is completely deterministic, but we don't have access to the whole universe. So the little bit of the universe that we get to see, there's an irreducible probabilistic way in which we make predictions for observations. So that's a kind of indeterminacy that sneaks into physics at a fundamental level. But that has nothing to do with free will. I think that almost all philosophers understand this, that the free will versus no free will debate is completely orthogonal to the determinism-indeterminism debate. You can be a determinist and believe in free will, a determinism and not believe in free will, an indeterminist and believe in free will, and vice versa. The point is that there are rules There are laws of nature that are never broken. That's the relevant fact. It's not whether or not those laws of nature are deterministic or indeterministic. If you believe that there are rules that are never broken, that I am a material thing made of stuff obeying mindless laws of physics, whether or not there's a stochastic element in the equations that I obey, it doesn't matter to whether or not I have some sort of libertarian free will that I can overcome and be a law unto my own. I do not believe that is true. So I do not believe that there's any sense in which I can ever do anything other than the laws of physics applied to the stuff I'm made of would tell me to do. I don't believe in that kind of free will. But I nevertheless think that free will is a perfectly legitimate concept that we can use to talk about the emergent macroscopic level of human beings. And this is where there is a sort of philosophical debate, which to this day I'm not sure is an interesting debate or a boring debate. Is it sensible to use the concept of free will if you don't believe in sort of the strong libertarian overcome the laws of physics way of thinking about it? I'm what we call a compatibilist, so I know for a fact that when human beings talk about other human beings, they use the vocabulary of making choices, of rationally thinking of things and choosing between alternatives. I don't think it's possible to talk about human beings in any sensible way without using that vocabulary. I don't think that the concepts of choice making are there in the fundamental laws of physics, but I don't think that temperature or pressure or entropy are there in the laws of physics either. They're emergent phenomena at the macroscopic scale. I would advocate treating free will in exactly the same way.
Yeah, I mean, once again, you're not being divisive enough.
You guys are making my job too tough.
Yeah, so maybe we should have a debate about what are the differences in our beliefs. So now, so I agree with what Sean said on many levels. First of all,
let me challenge that real quick. So you believe basically we're chemical reactors running away down the highway in time, and I mean, sorry, that's a rough interpretation.
I'm all for it.
But particles programmed to go, and there's no intersection. There's no. I mean, I think what philosophers would generally say is that that's not free will. And modify if that's incorrect.
So first of all, let me point out, even within philosophy, right, there's a division of labor, and there are certain murky problems that I stay very far away from as a professional discipline, right? So I have my own personal opinions on these things. And so the question of dualism, materialism, about the human, wow, what a tough problem. I mean, that is a really tough problem, especially I think if you're a theist of some sort, because if you're not like already committed to naturalism, I think you have a slightly open mind about these questions in the sense of you're like, wow, I'm not really sure what I should think about this. And then beyond that, I don't know I mean, there's lots of evidence from science that you can explain so much mental phenomena in terms of physical phenomena, and yet the scientific program is not far from complete. I don't know where that's going to go. I certainly don't like the spirit, as you might guess, of saying when I look at my fellow human being and behold another chunk of matter, right? I mean, that's not a spirit that I'm willing to endorse. I mean, I think that the language of, as so many religious people use, image bearer of God is a more appropriate language to use for another human. So when you speak about an ensouled being, a being with a soul, for me, that's not I'm saying there's a thing, there's the physical body, and then there's this mental thing. Necessarily, I'm not saying it's not, but that's not part of my commitment in everyday life. But my commitment is more of sort of an agnostic, I don't know what this mystery is, this human being, which is a created thing, according to my worldview. So it's not, we're not a bunch of gods, we're not uncreated things, we're created things. Now, are all created things physical? I don't know. I don't know what that means exactly. So there, on that question, I'm fairly agnostic. On the question of, so I actually like compatibilism when it comes to just free will and determinism, but more, not because I've found the arguments compelling, it's more of for me, it's a methodological compatibilism, because I think that a physicist should be able to be neutral about these murky metaphysical questions when doing physics, because I think we don't know, and I think it's very bad to start looking at physical data trying to find your metaphysical biases confirmed. So I think, if, for example, if you thought free will demanded indeterminism, and then you were doing physics, I think you would constantly be looking for that spontaneous thing to happen. I think that's not the right way to do physics. A lot of physicists have thought determinism was some sort of regulative ideal, right? That's the way Einstein speaks about physics. Einstein can't stand quantum mechanics because there's no reason for what happens. He wants a reason. So some physicists have thought that. Some physicists don't think that. Some physicists are happy with the spontaneity they see in some of the things that happen in some interpretations of quantum mechanics. I actually think, though, there's a sort of a deeper lesson, though, to be drawn from, again, the theme of the relationship between the data that science is supplying here and your overall worldview. And I think, once again, we see there's an underdetermination here going from science to worldview questions, in the sense that there are different interpretations of quantum mechanics, some of which are deterministic, some of which are indeterministic. So the physics itself, per se, is not going to force your hand on this issue. It's the physics plus stuff that's coming in from the, wherever else you're deriving this. Now, I think these constraints that apply to your overall worldview come from other sciences, right? You might have views about biology, you might have views about chemistry, you might have views about regulative ideals like Einstein. You might think physics has to be deterministic. Or I have friends who are theists and who think you have to have indeterminism because they have this view of open theism and God creates a universe with spontaneity. I'm not such a great theologian that I think I know whether that needs to be how God creates. So that's something I haven't committed myself to. But I think the fact that as science stands right now, it's not going to answer that question for you is an interesting datum to take into account. A datum, once again, about, I think one thing Sean and I could agree on is that you've got to do a little bit of philosophy too. You've got to come and say, look, here's your scientific data. Now let's talk. How does this make sense? How does this fit into an overall package of a story about what's going on?
So we're going to get to another point of disagreement, I think. It's always more interesting to see you guys come back. In the God delusion, you can always count on Richard Dawkins to start up. Richard Dawkins writes, Jesus, if he existed, was surely one of the great ethical innovators of history. The Sermon on the Mount is way ahead of its time. His turn the other cheek anticipated Gandhi and Martin Luther King by 2,000 years. Who do you think Jesus is, and why do you think he continues to both inspire and divide people? Sean, who do you think Jesus is?
So, fortunately, it's getting late, and nobody cares about my beliefs about who Jesus was. But let me just say that as a naturalist, I think that, we need to invent, as I think I previously said, we invent values and morality and purpose. And the difference between me and so I believe that the people who wrote the Gospels invented things. And the difference is that the people who wrote the Gospels thought they were getting something from the outside. But since I think that everything is an invention of human beings, I'm very willing to look at the Gospels or to look at any other book or wisdom literature, whether it's secular or religious, for inspiration, for good ideas. There's clearly, if you look at the Bible, and again, this is part of what makes me an atheist rather than a theist. If you look at the Bible and you imagine what God could have done in terms of helping human beings write a clear and interesting book, there's a lot of a good editor would have helped with the Bible, clarifying things, removing some inconsistencies and so forth. But there's some good stuff in there. And I think that it's absolutely valid for a naturalist to look for inspiration and good ideas in the life of Jesus just as much as anywhere else. The only difference is he doesn't get any special consideration just because he's Jesus.
Hans, who do you think Jesus is?
This is an interesting quote from Dawkins. I'm not sure where this comes from. I'm sort of surprised to hear Dawkins say this, but also I think it's kind of ironic sort of quote because you think Dawkins is supposed to be this exemplar of the scientific attitude, right? So what does a scientist do, right? A scientist faces all the data, even the data they don't like. And so if you take the datum that is Jesus, and then you say, oh, he was way ahead of his times, and pacifism and love and togetherness. Okay, that's one datum. How about the other datum where he says things like, I'm the only way to God? Well, that's not so nice to deal with. How do you incorporate that into your picture here? And of course, there are ways to incorporate it into a naturalistic worldview. You say, the standard sort of shtick, right? He was lying. Someone was lying about what he said, et cetera. There's lots of sort of ways of explaining that datum in a non-straightforward way. Now, Do I think it's completely obvious, though, that this kind of stuff, this data, is just easy to incorporate? I mean, like, oh yeah, I buy it, it makes sense to me. No. And Jesus didn't, stuff he says, I'm a stumbling, I'm going to cause trouble for you. I'm going to make your worldview come crashing down around you. And that's not a fun thing for anybody. So let me take a particular example, an example that I found for me to be a stumbling block to something, and actually still, I'll admit, I have days where I think, this is kind of embarrassing. This can't be what my self-description is like. So think about where Jesus says things like, you have to be like a child to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And I think there's one way that you can think of that, and you think, okay, what that means is I have to be, it's like taking a pill where you're going to forget temporarily your skeptical, critical faculties so that you can buy this absurd story, right? You're just going to suspend disbelief, as the literature teachers tell you to do, right? You're reading a story and you're like, this is wild. And then Jesus says, no, suspend disbelief and just buy it. And that strikes me as an attitude that I don't find to be comfortable. But then I think about it again, and I think maybe I thought about that wrong the first time through. So thinking that, be like a child means suspend your critical faculties. So I have 2 little kids, and I've learned a lot, probably more than I ever learned academically, just by hanging around them about what humans are like and so on. And here's what kids are like, right? Kids are like really good scientists, right? Kids are really curious to the point of utter annoyance, right? So you can't shut them up, right? There's why this, why that. And the other thing that kids do is kids see phenomena in ways that we've learned to stop seeing them, right? Because we have our own interpretive gloss that we're going to stick with no matter what we see. So we're not ready for surprise as we adults. And so this is one way I help myself when I start to worry and I start to think the lesson, the more challenging, this one challenging call that Jesus makes of being like a child, when I think that's not the kind of life I want to have, and I think actually maybe it is, maybe the life I'm called to have is one where I kind of occasionally stop and think, maybe I'm not so smart after all. Maybe I need to start to rethink things from scratch about a certain issue. And so I think that is a very critical part of anyone's encounter with Jesus, is for the harder parts, the part where it's a real challenge, deciding, are you going to try to make sense of that challenge? Or, I think the response of pushing it away and saying, look, this is something I'm going to treat as a falsehood and something that I don't want to take seriously.
So would you go beyond Jesus as a moral teacher or a challenger?
Well, I do certainly, and that's, so I don't come to that directly because I find that a very, I'm no theologian, and so if I say something like Jesus is God, which is a statement I affirm, but I don't have much more to say about it beyond then. I'm sort of a creedal Christian in the sense that I say the creed. I don't have a theory of that, So for me, it's a worldview commitment, very core to my worldview. It's not the sort of commitment for me that has this sort of empirical graspability that, say, the claims of contemporary physics have.
All right, with that, we'd like to open up the mics. Also, you can text questions, I believe, or email them in. Or there will be a number floating overhead to which you can text your questions. And we will try to process through those for those that are a little bit shyer at the mic. So please feel free. Also, we'd like to give preference to students to ask questions. So if we could go for the first 10 minutes with students lining up, we'd appreciate that. I'm sorry, I know that some of our more advanced students are very well prepared, but we're gonna look for our more junior students.
All really students.
Something you said, Professor Carroll, really struck me as you were talking, how we're so small, we're such a small part of the universe. We can't possibly know it all. So I'd like both of you, since you're both making a pretty serious knowledge claim, to justify your epistemic situation. How do you know what you know? Why can you know what you know?
We start off with the easy questions, right? And then we're leading up to the... Yeah, how
That was mine.
That's a perfectly legitimate question. How do we know what we know? I think that, in many ways, this is you could take a course trying to answer this question, right, and still not get the right one. To me, it comes down to some sort of epistemic equilibrium, which is to say that we don't know what we know by first accepting without question some a priori principles and then demanding that the world conform to them. We need to always be open to questioning these principles. Where do they come from? Because people can have sort of inconsistent principles and so forth. But I think what we try to do is to sort of guess at some principles, or, human beings are not born as blank slates. We grow up with ways of approaching the world and apprehending it and learning. And we learn things about the world, and we try to systematize what we learn, and we sort of realize that sometimes our sense data is good, but it's not 100% reliable, so we learn how to check it. We realize we have cognitive biases we need to overcome, and we come to some sort of consistent framework of belief. And as a scientist, I think that there's essentially nothing in that consistent framework of belief that is not ultimately up for grabs. There are beliefs that could be true that I can't imagine ever accepting, simply because they might be true, but there's no possible way I would ever know, and it doesn't help me to imagine they're true. I could be a brain in a vat being teased by a mad scientist, or I could be subjected to false impressions of the world by evil demons or something like that. There's a million skeptical scenarios that I cannot disprove scientifically, but they don't help me understand the world. So I think that my scientific, empiricist, hypothetico-deductive approach to understanding things in the world is the one that is the simplest and most accurate. And that leads me, in the world we actually live in, to a fairly simple set of rules governing the natural world at a very fundamental level. And my rule of thumb is I'm going to believe those rules until I have good reason to not to. So I will extend those rules across the universe and even outside the universe until following those rules to their logical conclusions leads me to something about the observable world that doesn't fit. And then I'll try to update them and do better.
Yeah, so let me, look, let me speak a little bit more surface level about rationality as opposed to knowledge. I mean, just knowledge, to my mind, it's something, something that's true, you believe it, and it's justified, sort of the standard picture, you can nuance that and so on. But just to talk about rationality for a minute. So why do I think I'm rational to believe that God exists and so on and so forth? And actually, I think the story's kind of boring if you really get down to it. It's the same way that we're rational about a lot of the stuff we believe. So, why do most people think that, say, murder is wrong? Well, I think if you think about when you first started believing that, it was probably when you were like 5 years old or something, and you didn't really apply super critical assessment to things that, say, your parents told you. You just kind of accepted it. Now, what a responsible, rational human does as they grow older is they occasionally do a check, right? And they go, okay, here's the collection of things in the cognitive structure. Is there anything there that needs to be kicked out? And although I think theism is true, I think there have been many people in the world who kicked theism out of that structure for good reasons, because their belief wasn't justified in some sense. And so that was a rational move, where by rational you mean by the lights of what they knew. Now, for me personally, I just never encountered a case where I had sufficient evidence to indicate that what I was taught about that was wrong. And I had lots of cases where potentially defeating evidence was eventually itself, as they'd say, neutralized, right, where I found something countervailing. And I think that's what you're supposed to do when you're a rational being. And so by just that sort of very thin, weak sense of rationality, okay, I think it's a rational belief.
Yeah, very fast. On the quantum mechanical issues, not free will, not determinism, consciousness. There are definitely interpretations of quantum mechanics that allow for the efficacy of consciousness. I'd like to ask both esteemed professors to comment on their views on the advantages of quantum mechanical reasoning for having efficacy of consciousness in nature, and that materialism doesn't really seem to allow that.
So it is certainly true that there are some physicists who have included the phenomenon of consciousness as sort of a fundamental part of our understanding of quantum mechanics. And what I have to say about that is that I cannot be held responsible for everything that other physicists say.
So I have two things to say about the actually pull in slightly different directions. One thing is I think it's an advantage of not being a naturalist that you can be open to ideas like that. That's one thing. Now, to say the thing that pulls in the slightly opposite direction is this is a longer story, so I'll try not to say too much, but I do believe in what you might call a sort of regulative naturalism. That sounds scary, so naturalism may not be the right word here, but I believe that good physical explanations, let me rephrase that even in a more neutral way. Physics is in the business of mathematically modeling things. Now, that's sort of neutral about the question of natural, non-natural, but my goodness, mathematically modeled things look pretty natural. And so if you had a full mathematical model of quantum mechanical phenomena, and then you had something in it that you were pointing to and saying that's the consciousness variable or something like that, I'm not sure it would be good to call it non-natural anymore. I think that would be sort of a naturalization of consciousness. So I think that's just something we have to think a bit more about what a good scientific model would look like, and when would we be willing to, if ever, say, we now have a scientific model that explicitly invokes something that we wouldn't call natural. I think it's an interesting discussion to have at some later time.
Hi. It was really cool listening to you talk, Dr. Carroll. I'm totally looking forward to your debate with William and Craig pretty soon. I'm actually a little bit bummed. You kind of took my thunder here. I was going to ask you a question about consciousness. It does seem that naturalism is incompatible with the existence of naturalists, and other naturalists like philosopher Thomas Nagel really push this. So I'm curious. I know I felt like you kind of dodged it. You're like, oh, I'm not responsible for what other physicists say. But how do you, as a naturalist, deal with that tension? I'm curious.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Caught.
Two of us to get there.
The specific claim that I think is not even worth responding to is the idea that we won't understand quantum mechanics until we include consciousness as part of the explanation. I think that's just silly. But if you want to know, okay, how do you fit consciousness into the naturalistic worldview, that's a really good question, and that's a very hard question. And mostly, I want to sort of be deflationary about it and say it's a hard neuroscience question. It's a hard question about figuring out what actually happens in the human brain. I think that some people who use the phenomenon of consciousness to argue against physicalism, to argue that we must need more in the world than just particles and forces, are putting an unfair burden, explanatory burden, on science. They want to say, how can you possibly imagine that a certain configuration or set of motions of electrons and chemicals in my brain is equal to fear or love or something like that? And I kind of want to say, why not? I want to say, if someday I had a theory of what happened in the brain that reliably and demonstrably mapped things going on in your brain to you saying you were afraid or some objective measurement of your fear and so forth, I claim I would be done. I claim that would be the explanation. That would be a mathematical formalism that fit the data. And we certainly don't have that now. And I think that we're going to need improvements both in science and in philosophy to understand how these categories fit together. What I would deny is that there's any reason in what we know now to doubt that that is a plausible program to carry out.
And before we go on, we're going to take one of our text questions. John, have you ever come close to believing in God? When and why? And then to Hans, the reverse. Have you ever come close to losing your faith? Again, when and why? And
Oh, okay.
we'll start, yeah.
Have I ever come close? Well, let me see. How long ago was it? Half an hour?
It's an intense debate, huh?
Almost there.
I promise you we'll end eventually.
Okay. So, no. Okay, let me just be a bit more specific. I would say there were probably about 500 times, especially between age 17 and 27, where I thought, okay, that's it. I'm done. Here's the reason why it's no longer going to be part of my life. And then in most of those cases, it was a matter of like a week, and I went, oh, that wasn't actually a good argument against. Like, something just came up, and I thought, okay, actually, that wasn't a good argument. Here's the reason it wasn't a good argument. I actually think there's a tough, I think people tend to paint these pictures in extremes, right? There's a sort of social picture of belief as this on or off thing, right? Like you're either a believer in God or you're not a believer. And is your switch on or is it off? And I think a more vexing problem for someone who thinks of themselves as committed to a religious belief is, again, what is the content of that belief? And what are the essential components? And if something goes, has the essential component gone, or is it still there? And so I do not believe what I believed when I was 16 years old. I probably, for all I know, if my 16-year-old self could see what I believe now, he would say, that guy is not really a Christian. So I think again, there's just this continuum. And, yes, there have been moments where I thought I'm gone to the opposite extreme. But I think more often for me, there's these little movements, right, of saying update, change, modify, reinterpret. And then you have to ask yourself, where do I sit here? So that's more, I think, more accurate to the current phenomenology of my intellectual life.
Yeah, I grew up in a religious household, going to church every Sunday. We were talking about pancakes at dinner. I associate pancakes with what you had after church. Going to the IHOP, having all the different kinds of syrups, that's like the sort of sensory correlate to going to church in my mind. But it was, a suburban white bread, milk toasty, liberal Episcopalian kind of church going. And eventually it petered out and we stopped going. I did go to a Catholic university as an undergraduate, but I was already an atheist by then. And I think what happened in my case, it was not some dramatic bit of logic or empiricism that made me an atheist. Sort of while thinking about how the world works, because I was interested from the age of 10 in, cosmology and physics and so forth. And very quickly in my mind built up this idea that theism was not the best explanation for how the world works. It just didn't seem to fit the data, and it still doesn't. But for years after that, I was nevertheless held back by sort of what I now recognize as social pressures. Like, you can't admit that you don't believe in God. That's just wrong. And so I don't know if I've ever told this story before, embarrassing personal anecdote. What made me out of the closet atheist was an Emerson, Lake and Palmer song. They have this song. Some of you, the ones who laugh, know the song. There's a song, and in college I got into, the progressive rock scene. I was listening to Yes and Genesis and ELP, and they had this song about how could you possibly believe in God? The Holocaust happened, and, man created the universe and all this stuff. And I was like, they're singing about this on a record album that people buy. I guess it's okay to say you don't believe in God. And so I started saying it out loud. But implicitly, my epistemic situation had changed some years before that.
One more question from text. This kind of goes along with, sort of the idea, you're saying that on the record, the Holocaust. And obviously this is something you would say is bad, right? But where does morality come from?
We agree on that, yeah.
Yes, and is morality changing or is it universal?
Yeah, I think morality is something human beings make up. I think that it is not universally anchored out there in any external thing that the universe gives us. So I disagree both with religious people and with, atheists like E.O. Wilson or Sam Harris who want to sort of say there is an objective morality that we can actually investigate scientifically. I think that when we talk about morality, we're really talking about the individual judgments that people make, and that some of those will be irreducibly inconsistent with each other, and that there's no right or wrong. I think that if morality were really scientific, if a disagreement about morality was like a scientific disagreement, ultimately scientific disagreements can be adjudicated by experiments one could imagine doing. If one person believes the universe is expanding and the other believes that it's not expanding, there are data we could collect. If one person believes that something is morally right and another person believes something is morally wrong, I cannot even conceive of the experiment that we would do. So I think that morality talk is a way of systemizing our personal preferences that we simply have. And we want to make those preferences both personally consistent, because we're not born with logical moral systems in our heads, and we want to make them socially coherent. We want to say, well, what do other people like? I am not absolutely without empathy for other people's desires. And that whole project of systematizing my own personal beliefs and making them compatible with other people's moral feelings is what we call moral philosophy.
And Hans, do you believe in moral absolutes, that morality is universal or relative?
So this is a pretty tricky question because, you'd think, of course, someone who considers himself some kind of traditional Christian thinks there's moral absolutes. But I think in our society, saying that carries a lot of baggage, right? So that's, someone thinks, aha, he's got a list of 42 rules, or maybe 10 rules, right, that he thinks are rules that everybody should obey. They're culturally insensitive, that is right. They're rules that just, are, it doesn't even matter what language they're packaged in, right? They just apply as they're given. And that's not a package I'm ready to take on board. Of course, I think there's a moral order in the universe. So that's, I guess, where Sean and I disagree, at least in words, right? I mean, I think, maybe the words are a little bit weighty here because we both, walk around trying to be pretty good guys and, we're trying to make the world a better place and we think the word better means something. And so the disagreement may not be quite as substantive when you actually get down to it. We have different words we use. But nonetheless, I think that we have people who believe in the importance of doing good and always trying to do better and so on. I don't think that means we know what the code of morals is. I think even if you're a Christian theist, again, let's admit that we don't know exactly for us now what that message is telling us about the moral rules. I do think we know that it means in broad strokes that each one of us needs to look very deep inside and ask, what's wrong with me? Where am I less of a person than what I should be? And I actually think that, more than the specific detailed commandments, you might call them, I think that's the core concept of Christianity, is realizing that there's a standard, I failed, and again, I failed, I need some help here, I need some help. And that's something I definitely do believe in.
Excellent. We'll have time for one more question from the mic, and then everybody else, hopefully afterwards you can mingle over coffee and cookies. I'm sorry, we have quite the list, so please stick around for that. And we'll go to the last question from the mics.
The last question is probably mostly for Hans. Sean, feel free to pile on. I was thinking about what you said about how religion and science, when there's tension, sometimes one kicks back and sometimes the other kicks back. And so I was thinking, I thought in my head, thank goodness that we have, a science of various things so that people that take that take religion as the first word on the subject, and they say, well, I don't see any reason to say this is wrong, I'm going to go ahead with it. Thank goodness we have a science of mental health, because otherwise people might be worried about demons inside of people that have mental problems, like the example of Jesus putting the demons into the pigs and drowning them in the Sea of Galilee. I mean, certainly God would have realized that that was important, like that his message has a meaning, and that for thousands of years people were going to there was going to be untold suffering caused by these sort of assumptions that people are going to make. And I just wonder, why should I believe in why should I take the religious word first when stuff like that gets past the editor, like Sean said?
So first of all, I want to say that, I don't think belief in demonic activity was a peculiarly Christian thing in, 0 AD, right? This was just something that people believed back then. They believed in spirits and things like that. And they explained things that we now explain in scientific terms. We give scientific models. They explain in a different lingo. And that lingo was often morally laden in ways that allow people to demonize other social groups and so on. And we still did that this last century, right? We didn't use terms of demons, but we treated certain racial groups as some, we have these characterizations that aren't just descriptive, but that carry emotive baggage. Why doesn't God just step in and just stop all that, right? Why didn't God step in and stop the Holocaust? And when you go in that direction, I just think, okay, you've repeated for me the problem of evil, right? The problem that, God supposedly omnipotent, all-loving, and yet there's suffering, things could be better, and so on and so forth. And well, I'm not, a lot of good guys have tried to solve that, smart guys have tried to solve that problem, give the solution. And I don't have a solution to it either. It's a problem I have to live with too. Now, I do, again, not an intellectual solution, but I like the fact that Christianity, at least, says, well, there's a problem and it needs to be fixed. That, I think, is a very Christian message. When you see suffering and you're coming from a deeply theistic worldview, I think you think of, God grieving, and you think, this demands our attention. And so not looking backwards so much and saying, God, why? I think we should look forward and ask ourselves, how can we make this stuff stop? And again, I think if you're already a theist, this is not an argument for theism per se, but if you're already a theist, I think that's where you see science as a helper, right? When science is able to take something that's puzzling to us and that we think is morally charged in a certain way and say, no, really, that's just particles hitting into each other in a certain way. And then we go, thank you that we have intellectual capacities for figuring stuff like that out. And now, I think if you're a naturalist, there's another gloss you can put on this, but thankfulness isn't exactly the gloss you're going to put on it. You're going to be like, that's just the way things are. It's good for Joe that he's not going to suffer as much, except good just means what Joe wants. There's no sort of global sense of good. It's just what makes him feel better. And this is something that I think is a less satisfactory description of the problem we find with life in this world.
And that is a perfect segue to our final sort of closing remarks. We'd like each of you to comment on, in light of your worldview, what is the most important thing that we should be striving for, you would encourage students to strive towards? Like, what are the goals to accomplish, knowledge to search out, and what should humanity's goal be? In light of your different worldviews, there's a lot of overlap, obviously. There's a lot of agreement, but do you see people living out a different life because of the worldview that you each hold? And what would be different, do you think? Or how do you see people striving? And I think students in the audience would be particularly interested to know the trajectory that a worldview, your two different worldviews, take people on, both in terms of meaning and acts.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of kind of cliched things that we can easily agree on, right? You should try to be good people, love each other, help people, and so forth. Easy to say, harder to actually pull off in practice, as the history of the world shows. But I think that the sort of particular implications of naturalism, the natural world is all there is. And I think that the very last thing that Hans was saying is right to the point. If you take naturalism seriously, if you go onto Twitter and you look at Sarah Silverman's Twitter account, her biography is, "We're all just molecules, cutie." And that's what a naturalist believes. We're all just, atoms and particles moving under the elementary forces of nature. And if you're caught in the language or the way of looking at the world that is handed down by thousands of years of religious belief, then that seems unsatisfying. Well, if we're all just molecules, then what does it all mean? Does it really matter what happens in the world if we're all just stuff obeying the laws of physics? But I would say that a more pure naturalistic view of the world turns that on its head. We are what is important in the world to us. There's no other world out there. It's what we do here on Earth is the only thing that can possibly matter. There isn't any life after death. That is an absolutely clear-cut implication of a naturalistic interpretation of the laws of physics. The lives we are living now are not dress rehearsals for something in the future. This is the main show. The feelings that we have as people, that we get out of other people, the communal experiences that we share with each other are the only possible things that can matter in the world. It's a very centered, here, very tangible way of thinking about value and meaning. And, making that into a fully consistent and agreed upon philosophy of life is very much an ongoing project that we haven't completed yet. But thinking about the world in that way, I think absolutely has very crucial implications for how you think about why we're here and what we should do with our lives.
Okay, so two things to say about this. One thing is, I want to say I think there's no doubt that many people with a religious point of view, especially a religion that has some kind of afterlife type belief, there has been a problem with devaluing this life. No doubt, right? This idea of it's all just prep for the next thing. And so I think a critique coming from the naturalist side is completely valid as pointing out a mistake in a conception. But I don't think the mistake is intrinsic to a theistic worldview, and in particular a Christian theistic worldview. Because I think that a more mature theistic worldview sees that there's very little information given to us. Certainly there's a hope handed out to us, a hope that finiteness that we experience here, the idea that all my efforts for me will definitely end in the next 60 years. There's a hope handed out that that's not true, that there's something much more significant going on. And yet I'm not told, at least my take on the Christian worldview doesn't tell me the details of if you do this and this and this in this life, then forever and ever you'll get this and this and this and this, and here's the story in full great detail. Someone please give me that detail if you have it. I missed it. The story was told me. What I was told is the gift of eternal life. I don't know exactly what it means. What it does mean to me, though, is hope for a deeper significance than the here and now. So that's one thing. A second thing, though, that I actually think is just a negative implication of a naturalist take on the world overall. This is the flip side of a negative part of the some older theistic worldviews. So the older theistic worldview, Middle Ages time, there was a special group of people that got special treatment, right? The priests, the monks, the guys who had that special connection to God, who could read Latin, unlike those ignorant folk, out there farming the fields. I think that was a horrible thing. I mean, think about the spiritual welfare of all those people who were treated as if they couldn't have that special connection with God. Now, we have a new version of that, right? If you're a naturalist, who's the person with that special privileged access to the real truth about reality? It's the scientist. So, I actually don't like that as an implication of naturalism, and it's something that makes me bridle. Because I see all sorts of people out there doing things in this world that have nothing to do with probing the deep mysteries of the physical world. And I think what they're doing is deeply significant. I could give you a long list of these people. And so I think that the scientific calling, the calling to be a scientist, to investigate natural world, is crucially important, but I don't think it's somehow the unique right choice for a person who decides early in their life, I really want to do something good. I don't want to just pursue my own pleasures. But I think there's a pluralism of good choices, a pluralism that ranges from science to religious ministry to working in a financial market to working as a medical doctor, and the list goes on and on. So I want to endorse that sort of pluralism.
Just to very quickly reiterate our constant agreement on every important question, with different justifications, to me, it's obvious that naturalism is what leads to an absolute pluralism of values in the world, because the values aren't given from outside. We invent them, and there's a lot of different people out there. So obviously, there are many, many different things that bring true value to the world. Science is the best.
We finally got them to disagree on something.